Waiting in a bomb shelter in June, Bettina and I did not have a lot of time to think about Zionism. It's hard to imagine a more urgent and existential debate for Jews around the world who are not under attack. We've been asking ourselves a lot of questions. What is the nature of this ongoing conflict in Gaza? What does it mean to be a Zionist now? Is the government of Israel leading it into authoritarianism and fascism, even as it doubles down on its growing pariah status? I can tell you with absolute certainty that we did not think about any of those things when night after night Iranian drones and ballistic missiles were raining down. Here's the thing about Zionism. For most Israelis, it's not an everyday concern. With the exception of a small minority of those whose families came from places of wealth and or security to make an aliyah motivated by ideology. The great number of Israelis are there because they are refugees or are the children and grandchildren of refugees. There's not much time for ideology when your life is under threat and no other place in the world is open to you. Zionism, as we know it from 1897 onward, is a simple product of necessity. A rising tide of European and then Arab anti-Semitism compelled Jews to flee for safety. Starting in the 1880s, many came to the United States, fleeing from the Russian Empire, until we, in the United States, closed our doors in 1924 out of alarm at the number of non-Northern Europeans arriving on our shores. There was literally only one place to go. Yes, ideology was critical to the initial enterprise. It never would have gotten off the mat without it. But it was hardly a motivating force for the millions who fled for their lives to find a new home. Leaving a generational home of centuries in Morocco or Iraq to live in a tent city in Israel in the 1950s was a choice of necessity, not of ideology. Leaving the former Soviet Union when the Iron Curtain fell completed the movement of Russian Jews that had begun more than a century earlier, many still motivated to get away from anti-Semitism and economic oppression. Making the treacherous journey on foot out of Gondar to Sudan so that Israeli planes could save Jews from war and starvation in Ethiopia was an action of necessity. I can promise you that no one on those rescue flights debated the finer points of political, cultural, and religious Zionism or the contemporary Marxist critique of settler colonialism. No more so than the tens of thousands of French Jews who have made Aliyah in the last decades, again, fleeing anti-Semitism. So it was no different for us in June, as we waited through the small hours of the night, listening for the sounds of missile interceptions and for the occasional sounds dreaded of impacts. Grateful for the warning system that we carried in our pockets that enabled us to get to safety. Grateful for a code-conforming shelter in our apartment that kept us safe, and in fact, kept safe all but 2 Israelis in the entire country for the duration of weeks of bombardment. Grateful for the ingenuity and the determination of generations of Israelis and generations of Jews to triumph over any and every enemy assault. But for this, we and millions of our people very well might not be alive. So aside from the ideologically committed extremists in the current government of Israel, Zionism is not exactly the big concern there. What are Israelis worried about? Exactly what you think they would be worried about, and the answers that they keep giving in survey after survey. Getting the hostages home after nearly 2 years. I cannot believe I'm speaking these words. Ending the war. Their loved ones are called up again and again. Ensuring that Hamas is never able to attack again as they did with such savagery on October 7th. Getting their economy back on its feet and rebuilding. Getting to new elections and finally holding a failed leadership to account. But around the world, and around the Jewish world, ideology is very much in discussion. We who live in comfort and security are free to espouse and argue ideology in a way that those under threat simply cannot. There are many ideologies out there. We have grown to see Palestinianism become quite popular in our day. One variant of that belief structure focuses on the just cause of Palestinians, the just cause to live in freedom, with self-determination, able to determine their own future. And I would hope that most everyone in the world would agree with their cause for human rights, for freedom, and self-determination. I know that I do. But there is another variant of Palestinianism that raises the Palestinians to an almost saintly level of existence. A noble, indigenous people suffering in a way that no other people ever has. A people that bears no responsibility for its own situation and are eternal innocent victims. A people whose near century-long choice of armed conflict and terrorism is only to be understood as the actions of those who had no other choice, a nation of saintly and pure Sir Galahads. While I don't find this reading consistent with the facts of history, it is very popular with those whose knowledge of the world comes from Instagram and TikTok. It's nearly impossible to talk about ideas and ideology when we are no longer dealing with empirical reality. We also hear a lot about another belief, anti-Zionism. We hear it from Jews and from those who are not Jews. I ask, what exactly does it mean when somebody says they are an anti-Zionist? Do they mean to say that Israel was somehow a historical mistake and never should have been founded? Do they mean to say that Israel should not exist now and should be eliminated? Or do they mean to say a single state of Palestinians and Jews should take the place of Israel, which is almost a synthesis of those first two propositions? With many thanks to Chaviv Reteg Gur, a lead analyst for the Times of Israel, whose pithy response to anti-Zionism informs my own, let's take the first statement of anti-Zionism, possibly. Israel should never have been founded. What do you mean by that? Does that mean that the nations of the world should have opened their arms to the millions of Jews who would have fled the Nazi genocide? Do you mean that the U.S. should not have closed its doors in 1924, only to reopen them after the DP camps had emptied into Israel in 1948, when no nation in the world would accept the survivors of the Shoah? That the 800,000 Jews ethnically cleansed who fled their homes across the Middle East and North Africa should have been taken in elsewhere? I mean, if that's the argument, count me in for a kinder world towards Jews. I would love to live in that world. I would love to live in an alternate history where the nations of the world got together and rescued the Jews of Europe and from the Middle East, from the Nazis and from their allies and from other haters of Jews. Wouldn't that just be grand? Or does it mean that more Jews in Europe and in the Middle East should have been left to oppression and murder? Is that what you mean when you say that Israel should not have been founded? Or do you mean that those who survived should have been left in European DP camps for the rest of their lives, as until Israel declared independence, no other country was taking them in any real number? And if your answer is those two, then just say what you mean. You are an anti-Zionist because you would like the world better with fewer Jews in it. The next proposition: Israel should not exist now. As a blanket, I have never heard that said about any other country in the world ever. Have you? What other country in the world exists where other people are debating its existence? As a quick historical reminder, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan were all created at the same time by very similar mechanisms as Israel. Two of them have been perpetually failed states for decades on end. Somehow, Israel, though, is the special case. And if you say that Israel should not exist now, well, where should millions of Israelis go? Are they supposed to disappear? Are they supposed to die? Should they find refuge in the countries that didn't want them or their ancestors? Should they be chased to drown in the sea? Should they be sold into slavery, a practice that is unfortunately too common in that part of the world? Should the nations of the world gather together in a last military push to destroy Israel? Is that what you mean? The irony, of course, is that these two arguments, that Israel should have never been created and that Israel shouldn't exist now, only underscore the very reasons for Israel's existence. We don't live in an alternate history. So please forgive us for not curling up and dying to please others. Martyrdom is forced upon people, not chosen. In my heart, I do not believe that Jews who proudly proclaim themselves anti-Zionists have thought through the implications of their stance. It's 2025. A majority of the world's Jews live in Israel. We with security and wealth here in the United States, who exactly are we to dictate to them? A Jewish identity that rejects peoplehood would be a novelty, but it might not be recognizable as Jewish. The early Reformed Jews went down this path in the 19th century, proclaiming, in effect, that the only thing that differentiated Jews from other people was the manner of our faith, basically where we prayed. Subsequent world events disabused them of their folly. By 1937, we were a Zionist movement again. A Judaism devoid of any Zionism at all would be actually quite difficult to reconcile with the Torah and with rabbinic writings. Did our ancestors leave Egypt with the idea of finding a nice condo in Boca? When we rise in prayer, should we turn to face Brooklyn, where our grandparents came from? It's ultimately preposterous. Perhaps anti-Zionist Jews advocate doubling down on a secular Jewish identity with no attachment to most of the world's Jews. Perhaps that might be viable. But America has a history of digesting ethnic groups and leaving those who only can say, I'm a quarter this and an eighth that. The biggest Jewish city in the world is still New York. And the latest study from the UJA, New York, on Jewish population should give pause. They look at the 8-county area comprising greater New York City. That is all the way out to Long Island, to Westchester, etc. In this world's biggest Jewish city, you should not be surprised that the highest rate of affiliation is Orthodox, with conservative and Reform falling behind. The biggest group of Jews in that survey, and growing, is the unaffiliated or secular. It doesn't take much to reach a tipping point when the choices become Orthodox or nothing. Of the children being raised as Jews in greater New York right now, half are being brought up Orthodox. It's not hard to see a future when bagels and pastrami would be more plentiful in New York than secular Jews. And to what exactly is a secular Jewish commitment that rejects faith, and rejects peoplehood. Perhaps some version of secular Jewish culture unique to their city? Broadway and Chinese food on Christmas? I can easily think of a country that was founded as a secular Jewish haven. My dripping irony is intended. There are those who decry Israel because it's not a real democracy. Sadly, this is a somewhat valid criticism. According to the people who study such things, Israel is still a democracy, albeit a deficient one. The annual report from The Economist that ranks the governments of the world on a 10-point scale, the World Democracy Index, from 10 being a perfect democracy to 0, a totalitarian autocracy. The countries of the world as a whole averaged out to a 5.17. Meh. In the Middle East and North Africa region, Israel is the only country that is not an autocracy or a hybrid autocracy, as the region earns a 3.2, despotism by default. Full democracies get a score between 8 and 10. Israel earned a 7.8, a flawed democracy. But again, when your neighborhood is a 3.2, you're ahead of the rest of the class, aren't you? Now, for comparison, we here in America are bringing down the class average for North America. The United States earns a 7.85, almost exactly the same score as Israel. We, too, are a flawed democracy. What we have been seeing around us over the last 10 years is actually happening. It makes me deeply unhappy to not see both of these nations excelling. But I think it also shows that we are so willing to tolerate and accept in ourselves the very flaws that we will decry in others. Is antipathy towards the Israeli government and its policies anti-Zionism? Not at all. That's actually a hallmark of democracy, to criticize leaders and their policies. And it's hard to imagine anyone more critical of the Israeli government than the Israelis themselves. Millions of them have been protesting, demonstrating, shutting down the highways. Protesters are camping out by the prime minister's house, gathering in the square that was right around the corner from where Bettina and I lived something years ago, right? 29 years ago, 28 years ago. The political opposition have called Mr. Netanyahu an enemy of Israel and the Jewish people. Are you angry at the Israeli government and its leadership? Get in line behind millions of Israelis. I fear that much of the anti-Zionism we hear instead rests upon the internalization of a twisted and foul root that is gnarled through the foundations of our civilization. Hardcore anti-Zionism is not necessarily the same thing as anti-Semitism, but there's an awfully big overlap, which may even be unknowing by many who hold these beliefs. It's hard for me to describe those who believe Jews alone, of all the people in the world, are not deserving of self-determination as anything other than at least a little anti-Semitic. Since the early church fathers of the 4th century, there has been a vision of Jews that was codified as a necessary proof and warning to non-Christians. The reasoning is as follows. Jews were cursed and rejected by God for not accepting Jesus. Therefore, they survive as an accursed remnant, punished by God and man alike as a constant reminder of their status. We survived medieval Europe in part because the church, between persecutions, offered protection that Jews might continue to play their role in the divine drama. Some version, sadly, of this thinking persists into modernity. As an accursed people, or so we were called, Jews were continually cast as the moral lepers of every age, accused of the worst and embodying everything that good Christians did not. Satanic rituals, child murder, desecration of the Christian holy objects, obsession with material wealth, sexual rapaciousness, you name it, it's been thrown at us. Now, while this is rapidly becoming ancient history, the role of the Jew as the eternal antithesis of proper and good values, the locus of all that is evil, that has persisted. In the historical dialectic of Hegel and later Marx, the Jew is inevitably the carrier of that which must be eliminated. The worst things that a person or group can be called will always be directed at Jews, a living antithesis to the good. Just think of the last century and all the claims that have been made about us and all the names that we have been called. Bolshevists and arch-capitalists and a parasitic bourgeoisie. Unrooted and untrustworthy, and also somehow in charge of a worldwide conspiracy that controls the government of the world. Whatever a given society finds most odious will be draped around Jewish necks. This is the historic norm and the sociological rule. Today, our contemporary evils are now thrown onto Israel, the only Jewish country. Settler colonialists, oppressors, racists, thieves of indigenous land, practitioners of apartheid. The worst things that you can call somebody, sure enough. Now picking up steam is the claim of genocide, which, by the way, is a claim that the Palestinians have been promoting for 60 years. For those who think that Western civilization itself is the problem, Israel is conveniently the embodiment of every one of its sins. There is a history of the UN that has an obsession with Israel. The General Assembly of the UN has passed twice as many resolutions against Israel as every other country in the world combined. Think about that. If you are Israel, you would find yourself soon parroting the words of the first prime minister. The UN in Hebrew was shmum. Why doesn't Israel, much to my chagrin, cooperate with international investigations? Because they take it as axiomatic that they will never get a fair shake from the UN. I will be the first person to say that the Israeli government is not making things better. I believe it is easily the worst in Israel's history. It has been causing immeasurable damage to Israel from within and internationally. Parties are now in government that in prior years were banned for extremism and incitement to violence. Bad policy choices and incompetent people to implement them have been the rule. 2 years of war in Gaza have not ended, and the hostages who remain are on death's door. Recent polling showed 60% of Israelis prioritize a deal to end the war and bring the hostages home over continuing to fight Hamas. Now, there's no indication that Hamas would agree to such terms, but the Israeli government does not seem to even be seriously trying. There have been copious reports in the news indicating that the Israeli government is ignoring its own defense, intelligence, and diplomatic corps in the prosecution of its war against Hamas. Yes, ignoring what the intelligence services and the chief of staff have to say. Sadly, the decisions made by Netanyahu and his government are endangering Israelis and Jews around the world alike. I'm an American Jew. I cannot answer for him and his government. Yes, Israel is a flawed democracy, perhaps deeply flawed. For all that, though, on the greater scale, it is a bastion of human rights and freedoms in a region and a world that is filled with despotism. As much as I have disliked Bibi Netanyahu for the last 30 years, since his campaign of incitement helped fuel the murder of Yitzhak Rabin, he is democratically elected. I will not dispute that for a moment. Despite his failures, despite his criminal indictments, despite his corruption, despite his seeming callous disregard for the lives of so many, he is the prime minister. He will be held to account sooner or later. Yes, I and many Israelis deeply oppose the current government. But that makes it hard to explain the rush by so many to isolate ordinary Israelis if we don't see a deeper hatred at work. The world we live in does business as usual with dictatorships all the time. Not a word. Oil continues to flow out of Russia. Manufactured goods continue to flow out of China. Not a word about the total repression and ethnic cleansing there. Yes, but Israel is a democracy, so we expect more. Is that it? I don't remember the world exploding like this over our decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. I hesitate to speak the truth of that butcher's bill. How many lives our nation ended in those places? Let's face it, we prefer not to think about the million or so who no longer draw breath as a result of our actions. I don't remember university encampments, do you? I don't remember calls to divest from all American companies, do you? The country that we sit in is an actual result of colonization. We actually killed off the native peoples who lived here. We actually practiced slavery for centuries on our shores. We even wrote it into our Constitution. Crickets on campus. Clearly, the world sees something different about Israel. I feel compelled to speak the obvious. Israel is a lot more than its government, just like any other country. Millions of people living in a multi-ethnic democracy, simply trying to live their best lives to prosper. It's a nation of incredible creativity and industriousness. Israelis are a people with an ability to find joy and humor even in the worst of times, sometimes shockingly so. The home to most of our people, in all of their best and their worst. When we talk about Israel, we are talking about our family and our friends, as well as strangers we have not met, but to whom we are bound. My prayer this Rosh Hashanah is that every one of us maintains perspective on and connection to Israel. In Lanu Eretz Acheret, there is no other place for most of our people to go. It's home now. May this be the lowest point from which we will rise. May we remember that we are a people, Am Echad, Goral Echad, one people with one destiny. We are bound together as one, whether we like it or not. May we be reminded of this constantly in a world that sees no difference between Jews in Israel and anywhere else. We Jews, who have the luxury for ideological debates, should keep a place in our hearts for those who do not and have no other place to turn.